Hello, boys and girls, ladies and gents. This is Defub21, and I have just watched the final episode, episode 10 of season 3 of Star Trek Picard. And, well, here's my review of it. There may be spoilers, there may not be. Just be warned. The point of comparison that I've been making between this show has been the near parallel running of season 3 of The Mandalorian, which has 8 episodes compared to this season of Star Trek Picard's 10. And I've been comparing them non-stop. They're both science fiction shows. They're both the two big intellectual properties with the name, sci-fi properties with the name Star in them. They both came out kind of within, I want to say, 20 years of each other. Star Trek first in kind of early mid-60s, and then Star Wars in the latest 70s. So it's a good point of comparison, and certainly these two intellectual properties slash universes have been, very significant in my life since I was a kid. And in comparing again these two shows and these two seasons, it really, really does come down above all else to the writing. And Star Trek Picard, while again it, being, effectively a sequel to a show that was, a television show that was basically aired during what was effectively the peak of broadcast television, when there was little in the way of competition for cable or satellite at that stage, the latest 1980s, mid to latest 1980s till the early 1990s. In other words, with Star Trek Next Generation, the show does lack some of the bite, or in the case of something like a Game of Thrones, an awful lot of the bite that modern, particularly streaming shows that don't have to deal with a risk-averse slash controversy-averse advertisers, not to mention the case of the US, a ridiculously overly stringent regulatory environment on broadcast television, the way all broadcast television in the US does. I don't think you can even say the F word even at 10 o'clock at night. It's crazy, quite frankly. But anyway, that's a debate slash argument for another day. Apart from that one issue, this show, again, Star Trek Picard, is much, much, much better written. Well, this season of it is. The first one was terrible. The second season I didn't go near. But certainly, and again, it could be argued that the season 1 and season 2 of Star Trek Picard were significantly inferior, worse than season 1 and season 2 of The Mandalorian. But with this season, it's basically flipped around. Star Trek Picard season 3 is much better written than season 3 of The Mandalorian. And one could argue that in a base kind of structural way, season 3 of Star Trek Picard is better written than either season 1 or season 2 of The Mandalorian. This is not, old school, obsolete, as I would see it, episodic storytelling and writing was what you've seen to at least a degree with The Mandalorian. Instead, you have proper serialized storytelling with story threads starting in one episode and usually taking several episodes or even an entire season to come to fruition. In comparison, in The Mandalorian, it's done in a very slap-hazard fashion. You've got that particularly long episode of Mandalorian, again, I think it was episode 4, where the bulk of it is set on Coruscant, covering or basically following a bunch of ex-Imperial people who are being rehabilitated. That story arc should have been integrated into multiple episodes of the entire course of the season, and not instead have this big chunk, literally the majority, one of the longest episodes of the season, like 50 minutes around. I think a little bit longer than that episode was, which is a long episode considering that the final for The Mandalorian was like 38 minutes long, and there was one episode that was only 30 minutes long. It was having that much, it was an important story part to do, again, in this episode 4 of The Mandalorian on Coruscant. And I think I liked it, although a lot of people thought it was too slow and or boring. But it should have been, that whole story arc in that episode should have been broken up and written into the pilot, or the first episode of the season, the second episode, the third episode, the fourth episode and probably the fifth and sixth as well, and it just wasn't, and it should have been. And it gives you a kind of an example as to where the Mandalorian, again, as I said, this season has been very, very weak. Although again, it's always been more episodic to its detriment, in my opinion, than it should be, or that it needs to be, because it's a streaming show. Picard this season is, as I said, is highly serialized in its storytelling. It is, by virtue of this, much more entertaining than The Mandalorian is. I accurately describe The Mandalorian as being genuinely quite frustrating this season. You've got, admittedly, in terms of the main cast, a much larger main cast than you've got on The Mandalorian, which is basically Pedro Pascal for the most part doing voice acting, and a stunt man in wearing the Mandalorian suit, acting as the Mandalorian, or acting as Din Djarin, while actually not being Pedro Pascal. Again, it's the same situation as you had with Darth Vader. You've got one actor wearing the suit, and then another actor, James Earl Jones, doing the voice. Katie Sackhoff, I thought, was pretty good as Bo-Katan, and she originated the role, so there's no surprise there. But it's, again, compared to Picard, it's just so badly written. And the key reason why this is again the final episode of this season, is so much better than the season final of The Mandalorian, has actually nothing to do with the episode itself, but everything to do with what has led up to this episode. And by that I mean there's been a steady, concerted build-up over the course of the season in Star Trek Picard. Again, one story thread after another, giving more clues, more plot points, building up to the crescendo at the end of the season. And that's just not happened in The Mandalorian, because it's just so badly put together in terms of the writing. And some of the stuff, and again, is genuinely stupid. The whole space pterodactyl business around the Mandalorian's covert planet in this season, the just certain things that should have been, certain plot points that should have taken a lot longer and been kind of, really taken advantage of, instead done in over extraordinarily short period of time in a single episode or just two episodes, because for some reason I can only imagine it's due to a combination of very poor quality writing and or the fact that, unlike Paramount, who appears to have been willing to spend the money for the most part, well, at least to a degree, well, actually I would say spend the money on season 3 of Star Trek Picard, because while it doesn't have the same production values that The Mandalorian has, it also has a much larger main cast who would probably have cost a not insignificant amount of money to hire. So their probable budgets are I would imagine, similar, or at least they would be, if it weren't for the fact that Disney just appears to be unwilling to spend the money to make proper big budget appointment television. And so you get these budget cuts, not in production quality, but in the number of episodes, the length of the episodes. And then exacerbates, makes even worse, again, the poor writing. And it is poor writing. There needed to be an overall plan from the very beginning when the season 3 of The Mandalorian was being written. All the core plot points in place, all the key story points running through from one episode to the next, fully mapped out. And then the full-blown writing of the dialogue and all the rest should have begun. And something like that was done with Star Trek Picard, and it wasn't with The Mandalorian. And so even if the episode 10 of Star Trek Picard were nowhere near as well written, nowhere near as well acted, even if the production values were nowhere near as good, the build up to the season final is vastly superior to The Mandalorian's, because the writing from beginning to end is highly serialized in nature and to a much better standard than we've seen in The Mandalorian. And so this is kind of a prime example of, even if this episode was not as well written, not as well acted by a very capable and experienced cast, if it's, if it's, again, I'm not a big fan of member berries, constant throwing of popular things to the that the fans really like at them. Again, my belief is that fan service, when it comes to Star Trek, Star Wars, or any other popular intellectual property like Harry Potter, as an example, is just more new Star Wars, Harry Potter, and Star Trek content that's just well made and well written. And this is, again, there's not so much member berries, as apart from the fact that the Enterprise D is in the entire episode. And obviously, I'm of the view that the Borg were ruined by their appearances in Star Trek Voyager. But yeah, so far, I mean, I guess so far the season is over, and this is probably the last season of Star Trek Picard. But it's a much, even if episode 10 had not been anywhere near as well written as episode 8 of The Mandalorian, the build up to the final episode in both seasons has been vastly better on Star Trek Picard, and it has a real impact from the get go. And again, the Borg may be, in my view, past their prime. I wasn't particularly interested in that, but it was still a good watch. Enjoying again the crew, enjoying the Enterprise D bridge, and all the rest. And it's even if you have a relatively weak final, if you've got a well written season of serialized television before that final episode, and it's just building and building and building, as long as the episode isn't a train wreck and doesn't destroy the momentum built up over the rest of the episodes in that season, you can still end up with a much better final episode that people watching it are much more invested in than what you get with the final episode of episode 8 of season 3 of The Mandalorian. And it really does show, the writing is key. Budget can also be important. Clearly, Disney insisted on a certain number of episodes so that The Mandalorian was on for at least a certain number of weeks. They didn't have enough money to make proper 50-minute episodes week after week after week, so they had to cut corners, making the episodes shorter than they should have been, and so on. And that's how we've ended up where we are. Although it is possible, you could argue that there were various bits of chaff that could have been cut out of some of the episodes, and then have creating space for the more serialized storytelling, which would have allowed for shortening of other episodes, and runtime could have been moved around and things could have been better planned out and balanced out than they were. And it is quite possible that the show was put together in a quite chaotic fashion. We don't know exactly what's going on behind the scenes. But as it is, it's the best Star Trek we've seen in quite some time. I consider the height of Star Trek to be Deep Space Nine. I think Voyager was a retreat. It went back to more episodic storytelling when DS9 had moved more and more towards serialized storytelling. I think that was bad for the show. Very bad for the show, and for Voyager, that is. Star Trek Enterprise I didn't really like, and the more recent, as they call it apparently, Kurtzman Trek, I didn't like. Discovery. Season 1 of Star Trek Picard was a train wreck. I've watched bits of Strange New Worlds, but not enough to comment on it as a whole, so I'll leave the door open to that. We'll see what the next season of that is like. But yeah, I mean, it just shows you writing, and in the era of episodic storytelling in television being completely and utterly obsolete, because the only reason to do it is to avoid, too large a chunk of your audience missing episodes and not knowing what's going on. In the streaming era, where that literally can't happen, episodic storytelling, to my mind, in television is dead, and it is serialized storytelling is the singular biggest advantage that television has over film. And again, the Game of Thrones up until the last season or two being a prime example of this. And keep saying and this is a prime example of how decent quality serialized storytelling will beat episodic storytelling, particularly mediocre to bad episodic storytelling, every time. So that's my view / review of episode 10 of season 3 of Star Trek Picard. It is maybe not the best Star Trek ever. I consider the two first Borg episodes you see, or the second and third Borg episodes in Next Gen, we know, where Picard becomes Locutus, It's probably the best next gen Trek, along with that episode where Picard gets zapped by an alien space probe and lives through an entire life on a now dead civilization and just ends up with a flute at the end of it. I can't remember the name of that episode, but it's a really good episode. Spoilers if you haven't seen it, but I'd highly recommend you go see the episode. It's a great piece of episodic television, standalone episodic television. Anyway, this is Defub 21. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Please like the episode. And if for some strange reason you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please do so. Ring the notification bell so you always get notified when new content comes up immediately. And well, now I have to go find something new to review. I'll probably review the Ahsoka show when it comes out. Okay, for the time being, toodaloo.